as well that is here. The second, and then you go to page 7. This was my effort to basically delay all vaccine mandates for another 90 days. So from the date this went into law, which is an effective immediately date, it would say nobody can impose any vaccine mandate for 90 days. This would have said, and that my attempt here was to get all the CMS, OSHA, et cetera, rules out in front of us, see where they were in the courts, et cetera. Now, I understand this is not desirable to a company that has a mandate beginning on November 1st. But my concern wasn't that. My concern was getting everybody setting a point in time and saying, you can do this, but everybody gets 90 days notice. So reset the clock. If you're going to do this, we're resetting the clock on you. Now, you may, if this bill goes forward, you may get someone that says, hey, it doesn't apply to someone that already had a mandate. It's already taken effect, because that'd be ex post facto, and that's not allowed. But it does, anybody that has not implemented a mandate, it would say you're all on pause for 90 days till you complete the rest of these guidelines, including the first one we just went through, medical and religious exemptions. And then the third one, so that's Romanet II, and then the third one is Romanet III, and that is the employer is responsible for giving the employee reasonable alternatives. Now, reasonable alternatives is defined earlier in the bill, and I'll just flip back to it and give you the definition. Reasonable shall include, but not be limited to, reassignment of work duties, meaning it's in a patient care setting, you can be in a non-patient care setting, or et cetera. Or COVID-19 testing consistent with COVID with current guidelines. So that would give and not limited to that. There could be other things that may be reasonable depending on what the work environment is. So that's the reasonable alternative. So going back to that section on page 7, the regional alternatives, there are some caveats to that the employee can opt into. So it's an employee's choice that they wanted to participate in those alternatives. The employer still gets to protect their interests. There still may be an interest of, I need you to do these certain things. And then obviously the employee's continued employment. And finally, they're consistent with those who had got exemptions under the religious and medical. So one thing to be clear is there are a percentage of people in whatever workforce you are that may qualify and be granted a religious or medical exemption from a vaccine mandate. I think my belief is that is quite appropriate. It seems also reasonable to me that the employer has implemented some kind of other alternative for those folks, some testing or some, change of workplace or et cetera, to help protect their business. So all we're saying with this one is that, look, if you could do it for the folks that got an exemption, why can't we do it for folks that may not be eligible for exemption, but have some other reason not to want to receive the vaccine? This comes to the personal conviction thing that we've heard about, but there's no definition for that. So this is basically a way to say, hey, if you already are accommodating folks that have an exemption, what are those exemptions? And can we make it so that other people have it available to them? So I think that's the heart of the bill. 3 ways, right? 3 ways that medical or religious exemption, and then the delay, if you will, for time for everybody to get on the same page about rules. The other thing that concerns me the most is the OSHA rules and the CMS rules are incongruous. They're not the same standard. So you take a healthcare employer who has more than 100 people, they fall under OSHA, and they may fall under something very different for CMS. Now, I don't know that because we're awaiting the rules, but you can certainly see a scenario in the world we live in where we'd have 2 different standards, and a employer, also a healthcare provider, we're going, okay, now we got to follow 2 different mandates and they're different. And how does that affect different people in my own organization, i.e. a healthcare worker or an administrator within the same organization? I mean, so that's the 90-day, hey, everybody just take a step back. Everybody just take a step back. Now you could make it 120, you could make it 60, whatever. But 90, quite honestly, got us almost to the next session. Not quite, almost to the next session. So that was where I picked that date. And then of course the accommodation, et cetera. So, and then we get into, now I'll go back to the beginning of the bill, and I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I just thought I should start with, if you're going to have a vaccine mandate, you follow these particular criteria. Now, if you do have that, then we go to page 2. And if someone says, hey, I'm not going to follow this, I don't want to, and whether they terminate voluntarily or involuntarily, what we've provided here is basically a severance pay from the employer. Now, this is a little wonky because it's not unemployment. It's a severance pay from the employer. They're implementing something. Maybe it's being mandated by a federal agency, let's say. Maybe it's something they're doing. And you can, if you decide, the committee decides to, you could differentiate that. It's a federal mandate, they're not responsible for the severance or a different amount. But if it's just straight up on them, then we do think there's a way that folks that don't want to comply. This is not UI. Now, that doesn't mean that if they were terminated, they wouldn't also be eligible for unemployment. They would not. They could also be eligible for unemployment. This is a separate direct from the employer to the employee. And it's half. It's kind of a strange thing, and this is really this is page 3, lines 12 through, I guess, 17. It's half of 13 weeks, and 26 weeks is a standard unemployment time. 13 weeks, half of that. So it's basically a quarter of 6 months' pay. So it's 4 months or 3 months' pay. 3 months' pay is their separation. Now, because UI is done in quarters and in weeks, in weeks, I use the 13 weeks as half of but they'd still be eligible for UI. And that's on page 4, unemployment, lines 16 through 20. So if they were terminated without and made their case, they could be eligible for unemployment. So they'd get both potential. There are some places where it says you're not entitled to this severance pay. This is the bottom of 3, and they're basically all of page 4. They would not be entitled to it if it took effect before October 31st. Of course, we were assuming we were going to have a 3-day session, not a how many ever day session. So you can adjust that day if you want, although I would leave it as October 31st because we know there are several mandates that are timed for November 1st. But I certainly respect that would make potentially, based on the length of this session, make it a little bit challenging. Your effective date is you're backdating something. So anyway, voluntarily or involuntarily employment, and they would be eligible for this if the employer did not comply with the reasonable accommodations, all those other things. Actually, I used the wrong term. Reasonable accommodations is another part of the bill. Reasonable alternative measures. That's in
RAM.
Okay, well, now we're going to have an acronym. So I'm sorry, got to have an acronym. And if they don't do the RAM, I'm a sheep guy, so that means something to me. I don't know about the rest of you, but anyway. So that's page 4, lines 5 through 9. And then if the person began employment after they knew there was an obligation for a vaccine requirement, at least in my mind, it makes sense. They knew coming in, if they didn't want to employ with the person, they would have not joined the employment. That makes sense to me. So, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll stop there. I think that's the sum of the vaccine specific things. And then there's a couple other items that we'll get into later in the bill that are a little bit different. And I want to kind of segregate them in the questioning if you want. At your pleasure, Mr. Chairman.
So I think
Go ahead, Senator.
I think what I've heard is that he's opening it up for questions from the committee on that first part of that bill. My summary of it is it's a penalty for employers that impose a vaccine mandate that has no exceptions and no reasonable alternative measures. If an employer just says, everybody go get vaccinated, you're fired, they're going to have a problem under this bill. If they offer some kind of reasonable accommodations, then they're not going to have a problem. So that's just the top line synopsis of it. So questions from the committee?
Questions, committee. Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Speaker Barlow. That was a pretty good explanation of the bill. I have some concerns, and the constitutionality of the whole issue, and you'll see that later in my desire for an amendment. How are we kind of going along with a mandate to have someone do something that is unconstitutional? We're making this law kind of for that mandate. Or why are we doing that? Instead of saying here in Wyoming, you cannot mandate the vaccine. Simple question, if you don't mind.
Gentlemen, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman. So it's a very fair question, but that's not the bill draft before you. I was trying to find a place for the employers and the workers to have some kind of an understanding between the two. Saying no, of course, and that's a prerogative that certainly can have. And if you flip this bill draft to say nothing, no matter what, then I don't know that the bill gets accomplished some of the things we want to accomplish. What I want to do is give the employer and the employees a way forward to actually work through some of these challenging issues. And I'm not saying that saying no or ram it, I'm just saying, or no ram it is not another alternative. I'm just saying that, because in my view, I think that card is out the door. Out the door. We already have employers that have mandates, private mandates. We're awaiting federal things. I'm trying to find a place that, and maybe there is no place. Maybe there is no place. I respect that if that's the, view of an individual or the committee. But that's where I was trying to find that place where we actually give the employer some options, and we give employees some options. And if there is no reconciliation, then there's a severance and everybody moves their own way, and people aren't, just out of the job 2 weeks later and there's nothing. So it's not, I understand this is not a hell no, say no, can't do no. This is is there a way we can actually smooth off the ride if this goes to if we're in full force? So, Mr. Chair, that's the best I can do. This bill is not a hell no bill. This bill is there a soft landing for the employer and an employee if they can't come to some kind of accommodation?
Thank you.
Okay. Further questions, Senator McEwen.
Mr. Speaker, I might be missing it, but is this just talking about private employment and not government?
Mr. Chairman. So thank you for that question. Chairman, and I actually got to find the right place in the bill. This is line 6 or page 6, line 15. No person. This is government entity. This is private employer. This is an individual. This is an LLC. This is person as defined in statute. And I'd have to look at, you have a good attorney on your staff, but it's defined in statute. It is basically every entity, including an individual to corporation, et cetera, private or public, in my view. But we could confirm that. I will be glad to confirm that, but it was certainly my intent that it was any person, not any healthcare, not any employer. It's broader than employer, because you might have volunteer organizations where you're not an employer, but you have people that work, as volunteers. That would not be an employee-employer relationship. So this was meant to be as broad as possible. Mr. Chairman, Senator McCown.
Follow up, Senator McEwen.
Mr. Chairman, Speaker, I guess here's where we're going to depart on belief structures. I understand a private corporation or a private company having the right to mandate to their employees. I think if we allow government organizations to mandate to employees, we're violating both the state and federal constitution. And we're kind of letting OSHA walk the dog instead of, I guess what I'm saying is, I'd like to see language and I'll work on it, but I don't think the federal government has the right to force vaccines. And I think that's where we get into some constitutional issues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman,
Comment? Go ahead, Senator Kinsky.
I would refer to page 5, lines 20 and 21, where we do call out the definition of a public entity. But the only time that phrase is invoked is on page 9, where it says that you can't require proof of vaccination in order to receive for a public benefit. But it would be a fairly simple matter to add the words public entity in the appropriate places, such as on page 6, line 15, where it says no person shall require, to say no person or public entity. So that could be a pretty straightforward fix.
Go ahead, Senator McEwen.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to be difficult.
No, you're not difficult.
And I think the reporting issues, I'd love to hear what some of the lawyers would say, especially in the government arena, about HIPAA and those requirements. And I'll tell you a story. My mom was driving down 59 and she got hit from behind by a drunk driver that was using drugs. Her car flipped, it rolled. They rushed them all to the hospital. And when the police officer showed up to ask what was in the, I want to say perpetrator, the perpetrator's blood, they told him they couldn't tell him because of HIPAA. And in the meantime, he escaped. And I think everything COVID related, everything vaccine related, we're willing to kind of turn a blind eye. But if it's going to be something else, HIPAA is the most important thing in the world. But we can require reporting on people's health. It's how many other constitutional rights are we going to allow employers to take away from employees just so they can have a job? I guess I hope you see where I'm going. Eventually, we end up with a tyrannical mess. I think the book was called 1984. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the good senator's point, I think that if you want to limit it to who cannot require a vaccine mandate or have a vaccine requirement, I think that's fine. I think there's two different things here, though. One is who is the overarching authority? And I think there's a conversation to be had is, does the federal government have that authority? OSHA, et cetera. I don't doubt that. But then there's actually the individual entity that's responsible for implementing it, and that would be potentially an employer, et cetera. So I think there's two different things here. I hope we can beat the overarching thing in court or elsewhere. I think that. If not, then is there a way to soften the landing or to give a path forward? Obviously, there'll be preemption issues, et cetera. But I don't have any. I understand what you're trying to get to. I'm just saying how do we soften the landing for the people that actually have to implement it and the people that are the, for lack of a better term, and I'm sorry for your mother's accident, victim. The victim, i.e. the employee that either can or can't. Now to the HIPAA issue, and this does not require anybody to disclose their status. In fact, if we go back to page 2 and 3, both people that are voluntarily terminated or involuntarily terminated from employment because of it, part of the reason is they didn't want to tell them, and they don't have to tell them. They are not obligated to tell their employer if they're vaccinated. Now, is that a grounds potentially for termination? Yes, but only if they meet those other standards, only if they've tried the RAM, reasonable alternative measures, all those other things. So I'm not saying it covers all the bases, and it certainly doesn't cover that overarching potential authority or lack thereof of a government entity. I'm not claiming that. But the bill wasn't really trying to design, was not designed to do that. That goes to the hell no thing. And I respect that. I was trying to get to the next level is if it happens, how do we have a path forward for both employers and employees? And maybe actually soften not just the landing, but maybe eliminate the landing if we're consistent with what feds. I hope the federal government actually allows the RAMs, the reasonable alternative measures. Does it make sense? You have 100 employees in the state of Wyoming. They're spread out in 23 counties. They all work from home. Why the heck would you have an OSHA mandate?
Hmm.
I mean, that's the kind of thing that I hope we can get to. Reasonable alternative measures is these people don't work in the same building. I mean, so those are the kind of things that I hope we can get to. So I don't know if that answers, I know that doesn't answer the overarching issue that both senators have brought up. I'm just trying to get to the content of this, of what this attempt was, not what other things could be done with this attempt.
Mr. Chairman, I have a
go ahead.
follow-up question for Senator McEwen. I'm looking for the report. You made reference to a reporting requirement, and I'm trying to, can you point me to which part of the bill you were referring about a reporting requirement?
Go ahead,
Mr.
Senator.
Chairman, Senator Kinski, page 7, line 15 through 17. While it is not clearly stated it's a reporting requirement, it does hint that you can get rid of somebody if they don't want to report it. Now, if I was a diabetic, can an employer get rid of me for that? Or if I wasn't taking high blood pressure medicine and I had high blood pressure? At some point in time, we're getting just, I think, a little too intimate with people's health.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you,
Kinski.
Senator McEwen. So let's walk through, starting on 11. If the person requiring the vaccine is an employer, the employer provides reasonable alternative measures. So in other words, the employer is going to be liable unless they provide these reasonable alternative measures. And they have to meet these principles. A, an employee can opt into reasonable alternative measures. The employee can opt into in lieu of the vaccination requirement or a requirement to disclose their status. So the employee says, none of your damn business whether I'm vaccinated or not. I'll just test before I come to work, or I'll test once a week. The employer has to offer that option, or he's going to have problems under this bill. Or the employee can say, you know what, as it goes otherwise, he can claim an exemption. You know, I got a religious exemption. Or he can claim I've got a medical exemption. And I don't know how much more inquiry you can make under that because of HIPAA. I don't think you can say, well, tell me what it is. So I think that you're looking at a part of the bill that actually gives the employee the right to say, you know, no, thanks. I don't want to do it. So, and then the reason that I think it's important is that employers do have an interest. Some employers, if they're dealing with the public. So let's say we had another rebound. And so people are getting scared and the employers say, you know, if you're working with the public and you don't want to vaccinate, I need you to test once a week. So it's a supermarket. Or before you come into work, just like we did, you know, take your temperature, you know, are you sick? Do you have any symptoms? No. Okay, come on in. If you're vaccinated, you don't even need to do that. So, or you say, look, as I did once, you're running a chemotherapy infusion center. I have a very strong interest, as do all my patients, in knowing whether anybody in there has COVID, because it'll kill them. And so now the employer says, you know, you don't have to tell me, but I do need you to test before you start work. Now they have a rapid test. I'm going to need you to test before you start work. And then if you're COVID positive, you're going to have to go home. So it's trying to balance those interests, but it gives the employees plenty of options. But there are situations where an employer would want to at least know if you're not going to vaccinate, that's fine. Then are you going to test? Are you going to claim medical exemption? Whatever it is, we just need to know. So that's where I'm coming from, is that there are employers that have a strong interest in protecting the public and A lot of the public that want to be protected. The more sensitive, the more protection they want.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator.
and thank you for answering my questions on this. Unfortunately, I'm one of the employers who would not ask if you've been vaccinated and didn't do anything for COVID. But that's kind of where maybe we depart. My concern is federal employees. We can't really stop a private company from doing whatever they want. I'll defend that just as strong as I'm fighting against the government doing it. Up to the point, the private corporation LLC is receiving huge contracts or help from the government. I'll give you an example. That big company that you can order off the internet that abuses our postal service every Sunday to bring you the packages. I think they have gone so far down the path that they should fall under federal regulations. And I'm kind of wrestling with that and the language and how you get there. And I'll keep playing with it, but I just wanted to know my thoughts on it. And obviously, we've all been writing bills and spending time doing the research.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator.
follow
Kinski.
Senator McEwen. So this would, a private employer could darn well just say, I don't care what your vaccination status is. There's nothing that prevents you from saying, I don't care, I don't know, I'm not going to test. I'm not going to, you can still do that. This does not require you to do that. But take on, you lost me a little bit on the big internet company that has implemented so many measures they should fall under federal law. I'm having a hard time following, but I want to understand where you're going with that one. So help me out understanding that.
Help him out, Senator McEwen.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, that big company we're talking about loses money on every vertical it has because it makes billions off government contracts. So if it gets to operate that way and have, I guess where I'm going is a lot of these large corporations that have federal government overhead cover are going to help the federal government out with vaccines if that's what the federal government wants. And I don't know how we get there, but if I make tanks for a living or satellites or whatever, the federal government can flat out say, you have to vaccinate or we'll go to a different contractor. And they're starting to do that from people I've talked to in DC and the military complex. So they're almost using the corporation as another government arm. And you're right, they don't care what I do. And I don't see in here how it's going to affect me or my business. So I like that. But at the end of the day, it just seems like, and maybe we can't tackle that. It's just something I'm wrestling with my mind, but we can tackle constitutional and governmental overreach with government employees. I mean, if you're going to help build a road or a bridge, you're an electrician, how much of the public are you around? Maybe some, but the government coming in and saying you will be vaccinated to work for us reminds me an awful lot of Big Brother and taking advantage of the fact and some of the language in here, the penalties. Private companies can't afford those penalties. They have 100 employees. At the end of the day, a government, we know how the government works. If we need money, we get it. We find some more federal funding or crank up a printing press. But I hope I've made what I'm saying clear, because I'm really not trying to be obtuse.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, no,
Yes, Senator.
there's a lot of issues running around in here. So without this bill, a private employer in Wyoming could tell employees, vaccinate or you're fired. If we don't have a bill like this, a private employer could say, you get your vaccination or get out. Say, well, what about my medical condition? I said, I didn't ask, get out. We have to have this to protect the employees, to give them more rights than that. If we pass nothing and leave Cheyenne, the employers that just want to tell people vaccinate or leave can continue to do it. This says, if you cannot do that unless you give them 90 days notice, you offer them a religious exemption, a medical exemption. You have to offer them alternative measures like a work reassignment or the ability to test. You can't just can people because you decided you want your whole workforce vaccinated. If we don't pass something like this, the employers that want to operate that way have free reign. So I hope, but then on the federal part of it, you're absolutely right. That's the part that troubles me, is because you know the same, probably a lot of the same people I do. I mean, this fella sent me his most recent contract and he doesn't have 90 days to think about it. It just says a covered contractor shall vaccinate for COVID-19. You may provide an accommodation. What they've done is you can provide accommodation because of a disability or religious practice. You should review and consider any accommodations it must offer. You are responsible for considering dispositioning such requests and accommodations. Then they make it clear that they still reserve the right as the government to come in and dump your contract because they don't like the program that you implemented. And they strictly, they say in there, any contrary state laws is not applicable. They just say, forget the states. So the federal government, you know, I'd feel more comfortable in here if we had something that said, except if you're under a federal mandate that doesn't provide the kind of protection that this does. Because otherwise we're putting people between a rock and a hard place. But that'd be a different discussion.
Mr. Chairman, last time,
Okay, last
I
time.
promise. I
Good
understand,
discussion.
I understand what you're saying the bill does, and it does do some really good things. I just think we're skirting some areas, especially with the federal government, or state government, city government, county government, pick your government, or huge corporations that live off the government. And I'm going to play with it a little too, if that's okay. Because I'd like to see if we could get not the whole entity thing, but kind of get an understanding that if we're going to force people under government employment to do any of this, we're violating constitutional rights. And I don't know if there's any good relief in there if it happens with a government company. But and that's it. I'll read it some more.
Mhm.
You understand my questions, don't you?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think so. And I think part of it can be accommodated by extending the definition of public entity as applicable through here where it says an employer. We want to make sure that should be a simple amendment that the staff lawyers could do pretty quickly. That says employer includes public entities. And extend that to cities, towns, conservation districts, whatever. If they decide they want to impose a vaccine mandate, they can't willy-nilly fire people without providing, you know, opportunity for religious exemptions, medical exemptions, and alternative measures like testing. And, you know, we could beef up something in here to say that you can't actually require anybody to disclose their vaccine status. Anybody who doesn't want to disclose needs to be offered these other options. And so those could be fairly straightforward things. The contractors, the big corporations, the contractors, you're right, it's a dilemma. I don't know how to address that. And when the feds just claim you can't tell us what to do, and they tell the contractors, do what we say or you're just cut off. I don't know how this bill reaches that. And that's a good chunk of the workforce. You're right. That's maybe the largest part of the problem. And I don't know how we address that in this bill.
Thank you. Speaker Barlow, do you have something?
So, Mr. Chairman, there's just a couple other things in the bill that I thought we've kind of touched on the vaccine, and there's a couple other things in the bill. So if I could, Mr. Chairman, I'll just take you to the bottom of page 8 and the top of page 9. So the bottom of page 8 is basically the public accommodation. And this is if you're a employer or public accommodation, and public accommodation, of course, has a federal definition. There is a definition of it. So you're basically offering people to come in to receive goods, services. You also have an obligation, i.e. this is the no passport bill. This is a no passport part of this bill. Now, I know there's another bill out there that does this. This does it in a little different manner. Now, if you don't like the employer part of this, you just want to stick with public accommodation, that certainly you could strike the employer part of this and just say, hey, you can't require, but you got to give folks a reasonable alternative to receive the services. So that's the bottom of page 18. The top of page 8. The top of page 9, which is, and then this is lines 4 through 7. And this goes to receiving public benefit. So if you are eligible for, let's say, a benefit at DFS or a benefit, the CHIP program, whatever, a public entity can't say, hey, you can't come in here unless you show us your vaccine. No, you're entitled to a benefit. They don't get to say you're not eligible for it, or you can't even come to see if you qualify for it. You got to provide them the benefit that they're due. That cannot be a disqualifying factor. So those are two. It's a little bit outside of what you're considering the bill mandate. This is more about vaccine or not vaccine, doesn't matter. If you're entitled to a service or a public accommodation, there's got to be either reasonable alternative measures on the general side, but if it's a public service, they've got to provide it to you. Period. I don't care if it's your clerk of court or wherever, they've got to provide you the service that you're otherwise is a benefit. So my colleague, Mr. Chairman, if he has anything about this, that's a little bit different in the bill. I recognize that this bill was meant to do more than one thing. Now, is it more than a single subject? I'll leave that for other people to decide. But I believed it was single subjects, COVID-19 related. It's, whether you're vaccinated or not, that's the theme throughout the bill. This is another component of that. Mr. Chairman, and I'll just finish real quickly. The other thing that this bill does, and this is pages 9 and 10, is, it makes that let me see, I just got to make sure here. So it codifies the religious and medical religious grounds, the objection or written evidence of that on page 10. That ties back to that first page. Says, hey, look, if there's the exemption, the medical and religious exemption just codifies that in other statute. And then the other thing it does, and this is on page 11, it says, look, if you take a vaccine because you were responding to a employer's request and you're injured, that's a compensable injury under workman's comp. You're covered under workman's comp. Now, it is. There's a date certain, and it goes through a certain date. It's October 31st through March 31st. Well, we'll be in session before the end of March 31st. We can extend that. That's what we actually did the last time. In our last session, we extended it for COVID-19. We extended workers' comp. Now, interestingly, we didn't actually protect the employers from the rate changes. So we're going to have to do that in the next budget session, but we can do that in advance of their rates actually changing. So we'll be able to hold the employers harmless for the COVID-19 workman's comp issue, even though workman's comp is paying for the COVID-19 injuries. This would add the vaccine injury to that. Period. For folks who are covered under workman's comp. Not everybody is covered by workman's comp, but certainly those that are, it would be an injury if looking at the top of page 11. Last thing in the bill, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to my colleague, Senator Kinski, is $1 million. That's just a placeholder. If you want to give them more money to defend and deal with the OSHA and the CMS and the contract and other things to the Attorney General's office. And the reason, I know people are going to say, hey, they've already got 200 attorneys. Isn't that enough? This isn't about the attorneys they have in their office. This is about the attorneys that you have in the Sixth Circuit or in DC or at the Supreme Court, that you actually bring in folks that are litigants in that court and have the, the best dogs in the fight or the good dogs. So, and obviously we have an attorney. I'm sitting at the table with an attorney, so I can let him speak to that. But those are two other components of the bill, Mr. Chairman, three other components, I'm sorry, besides the vaccine mandate employer-employee relationship issue. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee.
Mr. Chairman, I think those are all good ads in the bill. I think they fit within the title of the bill, and I'd recommend them to the committee. Their
Spoken like
consideration.
an attorney. Thank you. Senator, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, my tongue's bleeding. I've been over
Biting
here.
it?
Yeah, biting it. Mr. Chairman, and bill bringers, Mr. Speaker, and I want to start out with I don't see a part in here where we exempt people from the immunity clauses that we put in during the last special session. So, because what would happen here is they could try to say they're immune from any harm for anything that they do in here that may be contrary to what they may deem as a protection. In other words, because you talked about harming people, that maybe they're being harmed, and this is going to rectify that. So there has to be some additions to the exemption from immunity clauses in the bill. The other thing is the medical exemption isn't really clear enough, because we already have medical exemptions, but they're not being followed. They're actually ignoring that at a lot of the testimony we've had in health committee. The public sector should be very strong, because as so the state government goes, so will the rest of the private sector. The 90-day thing here that I looked at here, or even the 50% and the 13 weeks after, that's not going to keep people in Wyoming. They're still going to have to go get jobs to pay their bills. And it comes back to page 10, where it says on line 10, page 10, if an employer requires vaccination for COVID-19 or enforces a COVID-19 vaccination requirement imposed by the federal government or any other entity, I mean, it's just almost saying, well, if you do it, we understand, and we're going to make you do this. We're not really saying that you can't do it. And that's kind of the issue here. And I think what I tried to do, we could have had a lot more discussion on this. All the kind of language that gets challenged in court, because you're saying that you're telling an employer what they can and can't do. Whereas I had a different approach, because if you look at it, and by the way, there's one more thing that you really need to look at. You're saying in this bill that you have to give reasonable accommodations. Well, let's just look at that for a minute. Let's say that what we had to do here is, if you are vaccinated, you can be in this room. But if you're not vaccinated, you got to be in that room next door. And that was a lot of the testimony that we heard. They were already doing that at lunchrooms, and they were discriminating against people. And we're talking about people that worked on the front lines, people that probably already have immunity because they were in it from day one. And that was the whole approach that I took differently, is this discriminatory action of the nature of all of it. And it got us out of this kind of language. So in other words, they shouldn't ask what your vaccination status is, and then they can't discriminate against you. This bill kind of does discriminate. So it allows in a discriminatory nature of what they're doing. They have to provide accommodations, is what it says, but we're not being clear what those accommodations are. So they could actually just come out and say, hey, we're going to do this to accommodate. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that worry me about this, and what I tried to steer away from, because I didn't want to make it a lawyer's dream of something where everybody gets to take it to court and take it to court and take it to court, take it to court. And in the end, we have people that are being fired and leaving. So, and I hate to be that hard on this, but anybody who knows me knows I've been on this issue for a long time, watching what's happening, talking to people. And I just don't understand how we've got to this point and we're still treating this vaccination like it's a vaccination when it's not. It doesn't, I mean, if we look at other nations that are the most vaccinated right now, I think Singapore said it best. Their medical minister, whatever their name, whatever their title was, said that the good thing is now they're gonna all get it and they're gonna have herd immunity. Because now they've determined that everybody's gotten the shot. It's just not working. So we're still just playing along with, we're still working with this of what we think it's gonna do or what we've been told it's gonna do. And I just don't think that's the right starting point because we know we have data now that says it's not where it is. There's people like me that I've had COVID and I have immunity. And we're not talking about that anymore. We were talking about testing people and seeing if you have the antibody. If you do, then you're in better shape than the people who are getting the vaccinations. So the vaccination is not stopping spreading and people are still getting it. So that's the key issue is how do we get to that point if we still allow people to ask? And if it's my personal, it's all of our personal healthcare. If you even discriminate and say, well, you guys got to go over there, well, you're telling everybody, hey, somebody go by and take a picture and say, hey, these are all the guys that aren't vaccinated and they can all be bullied. I mean, and that is happening in the hospital settings. So those are my concerns. So I won't belabor you with any more, but.
Comments, Senator or Chair,
Mr.
Speaker Barlow.
Mr. Chairman, so no, I respect that people can have a different perspective. Bring amendments to the bill. That's what we do. If you think there's a better way to approach it, this is the vehicle. The vehicle was written, this way. As far as the antibody testing, et cetera, that can be a reasonable alternative measure. Want to add it so it's specified in there? I've had the disease too. I've had the immunization too. I actually have some medical training as well. I know that immunity from a natural disease is different than a immunity from a immunization. I recognize that. That doesn't mean that I wasn't willing to take the vaccine, and I'll take a booster when it's available. You want that as an alternative, as a measure, but if you don't want anything, that's a different issue, Mr. Chairman. And like I said, this is the vehicle before you. If you don't like what's before you, I respect you vote the bill down. I've been doing this for 10 years. I voted against a lot of bills in committee too, because I didn't think they got to the point. And if that's, I can't make up something that isn't there. This was the approach that I took. Senator Kinski has looked at it and said, hey, it has some merit potentially. This committee doesn't find it that. I respect that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I look at this from a different perspective. I've been approached by several businesses that said, we're very concerned that you, as legislators, are trying to fight the federal mandate, and they're against that. But they said, what I've heard clearly is don't create a state mandate that I have to hire unvaccinated people. A couple of them said, we're in a safety business and we're going into a lot of homes, et cetera, and we want our employees to be vaccinated. And if we want to require that, we should be able to require that. So basically I'm saying, let's get government out of businesses. Let the businesses decide what's best for them. So in reading this bill, it seems to me you're trying to come to a compromise. You're not demanding that you have to hire unvaccinated people, but if you are going to do that, you've got to make some accommodations. Am I reading this right? Thank you.
Speaker Barlow.
So, Mr. Chairman, so the benefits of this would not apply to someone who has a vaccine mandate and the employee knows about it prior to the hiring. This is really only folks that the mandate is imposed upon them during their employment. At least that was certainly my intent. Now, if it's not clear enough, the good senator, if it comes out of this committee, the good senator and I will work to make sure that is clear. So that I do not want to step into a future employment contract with any private employer, including myself. But I do think there is a place for potentially, if you want, if this committee wants to say, hey, if you're in a relationship and the terms of employment changed because of some pandemic or government higher mandate from somewhere else, then let's have some kind of an understanding how we go forward. So respectfully, I would say I am not trying to say new hires, I don't believe are eligible, and we'll double check it, but that was certainly my intent. And we'll go back. But it's the folks that are in the relationship right now. If you're 6 months from retirement and the mandate hits you, or your employer is under a mandate, and we could have 6 months worth of reasonable accommodations, like it or not, that gets you to your retirement date and you get your full benefits, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's the kind of, I'm not saying that's the only thing, but that's one of the things. Or you get your severance pay. You can't work in the industry you had of your chosen profession. You take your severance and you go get retooled, retrained for another industry or another thing, and you pay your bills while you're getting that. That's the kind of thing that I was trying, part of what I was trying to get to with this. So respectfully, I'm not trying to say going forward, nobody can ever do this. I'm saying if you have one and the employee knows about it before they hire, that's you and the employee. And we will double clarify. I will double clarify that in the language. And I understand. I drafted this bill, and when I drafted it, it was step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. When it comes out of LSO, because we have section 1, section 2, things get flipped because you have different parts of the bill that do different things. You're amending current law, you're adding new statute, and it gets messy. But what I sent to our drafting staff, and we have an excellent drafting staff, and I'm not questioning how they approached it. I'm just saying it's 1 is in the middle of the bill, 2 is up here, 3 is here, 4 and unrelated A, B, and C are over here. So it is a difficult, I'll grant you, a little bit difficult to work through some of these. That's why I started in the middle of the bill, saying you can't do it unless. Timing wise, same thing. We didn't go in specifics, but there's 3 criteria. Doesn't apply in these cases. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hutchins.
Mr. Chairman, may I just also
Go
respond? to
ahead,
Senator
go ahead,
Murphy?
Senator.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'll-
Senator Murphy, I believe you're correct. This bill seems to strike a balance. This is not a bill to impose vaccine mandates. It says if you are going to impose vaccine mandates, you have to give employee protections. Without a bill like this, the employer could, as you say, there are some employers that say it's none of your business. If I want to start firing people because I want them required to vaccinate, that's my prerogative. And that is the law of the land unless we pass a bill, something to this effect. So we're trying to strike that balance. We're trying not to say, well, you can't even have any kind of vaccination in a workplace, but if you're going to ask about vaccinations, you have to give people reasonable options. And so that's what we're trying to do, strike a balance. If this committee votes this down, I don't know what else is out on the floor that really offers any protection for employees that where the employer just says vaccinate or get out. I don't know if there's another option out there.
Senator
Thank
Hutchins
you.
and then Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I appreciate all you said. And something was said, a couple of things I'm going to deal with here, that a corporation can come in and you don't have to obey the state laws. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. We have in our Constitution in Article 10, Section 5, acceptance of our Constitution. No corporation organized under the laws of the Wyoming Territory, any other jurisdiction than this state, shall be permitted to transact business in this state until it shall have accepted the Constitution of this state and so on and so forth. So when corporations come into the state, they're kind of saying, we're gonna obey your Constitution, Article 1 or 10, Section 5. And with that, I'd like to bring in a proposal for page 6, that if you go to line 16, and Speaker Bartle, tell me if this makes the cushion a little softer as well. On line 16, I'd like to see after the word vaccination, a period, and then delete the rest of that page and then add this. In accordance with the Wyoming Constitution, Article 1, Section 38A, each competent adult shall have the right to make his or her own healthcare decisions. The parent, guardian, or legal representative of any other natural person shall have the right to make healthcare decisions for that person. If an employer requires or mandates an employee to be vaccinated as a condition or precondition of employment, all applicants or employees shall be granted the right to a religious, medical contraindication, or right of conscience exemption if requested. If the applicant or employee chooses to get vaccinated, they may choose which method of vaccination or alternative COVID-19 preventative measures they desire, i.e. an injected vaccination, oral homeopathic medicine, alternative medicines, religious remedies, etc. The choice is up to the competent adult, parent, guardian, or legal representative. And I say that because there are other alternatives than the COVID-19 vaccine. We're acting as if that vaccine is going to prevent the employee from getting COVID. We've seen that in our own body, where some of the members in our body have side effects from the COVID vaccine shots. Some of our employees have even died after they've had the vaccine from COVID. So I'd like to see some alternatives to just the COVID-19 vaccination. Does that help soften the cushion, Speaker Barlow?
Go ahead, Speaker Barlow.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman. I guess I saw this language earlier today. I said, it's your bill right now. It's the Senate's bill. It's the Senate Labor Health Committee's bill. I don't suggest or pretend to understand what your individual interests are or what the collective interests would be. I can only tell you where the bill was generated from and the rationale for that. Look, I don't know that you need all the Section 1, Article 38 stuff. I mean, that's already published. That's the Constitution. If you want to have other alternatives, I think you don't have to wipe out all that section. You can just say reasonable alternative measures can include these things too. I mean, I'm not saying that, that if that's a reasonable alternative measure and you want to list out other possibilities, it already says not limited to. So if a person says, if an employee says, look, I think this is a reasonable alternative method, and the employer says, dang, I didn't know about that. Thank you very much. Seems like it fit pretty well with your work environment or all business model or whatever. I mean, I'm not suggesting the list was not exclusive. It was inclusive, meaning if you want to add something to that, it doesn't. Quoting the Constitution and the statutes, I mean, that's backwards to me. I mean, the Constitution is the Constitution. We base things off of that. So now to your point about, a choice of the vaccine, actually that was in my original one was it had to be a FDA approved vaccine, et cetera, or the person could choose something else, i.e. Emergency use, et cetera. So, I mean, I actually, I don't know that you need to wipe out all that other stuff. Maybe the amendment is to potentially add some of this in. Now, the religious and medical contraindications, I mean, that's taken up in other parts of the bill as well. It's taken up in Title 27. It's taken up several other places. So, and to an earlier point that was made about, they're not following the religious, or it's there and they're not actually doing it. Well, actually, if you take a look at, sorry, I should have had it queued up before I said it. Page 10. This is entitled 27, and it talks about object thereto. Current language is religious grounds. There is not actually a medical grounds in it, just religious. So, and maybe I'm flipping that, but one of the grounds is not in there currently, medical. It's not currently in Title 27. So, to your point, yeah, there's reasonable alternatives, but we ought to actually fill some holes in where statute probably does need to be, brought up to what we'd consider standards, which would include exemptions for medical or. Now, if you want the broader personal conviction, that was actually how I labeled it in my draft. But as staff is looking at it saying personal conviction, then what do we have to come up with a definition for that, et cetera? How about we just list the criteria out and say, this doesn't qualify, we qualify. So I don't have an answer for you as far, but I don't think what is already in there is precluded by the current language without an addition. But if you want to specify it, that's conversation for the committee and for the good chairman. And I should defer to my Senate colleague who is the sponsor for this bill because it's a Senate file, but that would be my approach to in responding to it, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Kinsky.
Senator Hutchings, so let's go to the paragraph in accordance with the Wyoming Constitution, each competent adult. I'm not sure where best to put that.
We can strike it.
Okay. And then the next part, which talks about the exemptions, I think is covered under page 6, where no person, and we should add or public entity, shall require another person to receive vaccination unless 1, the person requiring the vaccine has adopted guidelines and a process to accept religious and medical exemptions to the vaccine requirement. That's on page 6, lines 18 through 21. And it says in accordance, so if the person requiring the vaccine or public entity has adopted guidelines and a process to accept religious and medical exemptions to the vaccine requirement in accordance with statute 2711-113B, and that 2711-113B is actually created by this code on page, which is it, Eric? On page 10, which says they've got to establish that process. Shall grant an exemption as provided in this subsection. So I think that's encompassed. Now, then the language about alternative preventative measures probably fits nicely on page 5, lines 7 through 9, Romanet 2, where we define what a COVID vaccination is.
Mr. Chairman, can I answer?
It's just a thought.
Yeah, go ahead, Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, gentlemen. I have no problem with that. I see clearly that the Constitution doesn't need to be there. I would like to still work on the right of conscience exemption, get that in the bill and get that defined. I will work on getting a definition for you guys if we can get that in the bill. But I would really like to go over and get in your bill those alternatives to the COVID-19 vaccine. Those preventative measures, I think, are an awesome option for anybody. Again, we're acting as if the COVID-19 is the only way to go when there are so many alternatives out there. I'd like to see them added. So I'm willing to strike a lot of this, but get some of those added. Senator Kinsky, on the page 5 and 7 where you mentioned it, and add that right of conscience everywhere where you have the religious and medical exemption. So if we can get that worked here at the table, I'd like to get those added with your approval. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Speaker Barlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I do think that the alternative measures, I think, not alternative measures, now we're getting reasonable accommodation, alternative measures and other options, other healthcare options. How's that? I don't know what term. You used a different term and I apologize. I don't see it here, but actually I think it fits maybe under the definition of reasonable alternative measures, which is on page 6. I think it's a Romanet C, capital C, and you can say other options of the, et cetera. So that might be a place because that gets it in the definition. And then it's more inclusive. It's spread throughout the statute potentially. The other thing I would say, the reasonable, the personal conscious, I'm getting unconscious here, so I
Right of
apologize.
conscience.
The personal conviction, I think that's the word maybe you used. If you go to page 2, and this can be modified a little bit. Person voluntary terminate his employment as a means of personal conviction or a means of whatever. You could actually say here, they just don't want to divulge, and they're making that choice. You could maybe insert it there, and then it makes them, I think, and I would have to go through it, the entire act would still apply to them. And they could terminate their employment and be eligible for all those things.
Mr. Chair, but you're saying there that they want to be terminated. They don't want to be terminated. They still want to work, but they have the right of conscience that the Constitution allows them. That's what I'm saying there. If we don't allow that, then we are giving the employer kind of roughshod over the citizens, and that Article 1, Section 38 of the Constitution means absolutely nothing. You yourself said you even wanted it there, so we'll work on it together. How's that?
I leave it in the capable hands of the Senate.
Thank you.
Senator Bouchard, you had something.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just have a question. Do you think OSHA, federal OSHA, has the power under the proposals of the current administration in DC to impose the power under OSHA? I mean, because we have our own state OSHA and we have a state legislature. I mean, if they have that kind of power, what do we even need to be here for?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Kinski.
so that relates back to the last page of funding the Attorney General's office to really be able to attack that. The AG, there's 24 state GOP AGs that are ready to launch as soon as the regulation is issued. I think that they have stretched the OSHA statute beyond all reason because the pertinent part says to protect people from hazardous fumes, vapors, or other substances in the workplace. How they stretch that to a virus and a vaccine mandate is completely beyond me. And I think, I believe that the day that regulation is finally issued, the next day, there will be 24 AGs that file for an injunction, and there will be a federal judge somewhere who will enjoin that. Now, whether it makes its way to the Supreme Court or not, I don't know. The other concern that doesn't implicate this bill, but you've heard that concern, is we have our own state OSHA because we told the feds, we don't want your OSHA inspectors coming from Denver or Kansas City or Dallas. We'll do it ourselves. The concern is that, so one idea I had initially, and it's off topic and I apologize, Mr. Chairman, is we just prohibit our OSHA people from having anything to do with it. The concern is that the feds will just say, that's fine, we take back primacy on OSHA. And now all your inspections are going to come out of Denver or Texas. So, I mean, these are people that really know how to pull the levers of power. I mean, it's a federal OSHA law. The other attack I think that would apply to the OSHA is just personal rights. That you're imposing a vaccine mandate. Now, this is, if everybody points to this 1907 Jacobson case, He refused to get the vaccine, but it was a $5 fine. They didn't make him, they didn't fire him. They didn't bankrupt his business. It was a $5 fine. This is something fundamentally different. And our idea, as one judge said in, I think it was Michigan, our ideas of personal liberty have substantially changed since 1905. So, I mean, the argument that I would make to the Supreme Court is, how can you say that a woman has the right of choice to go get an abortion, but an employee doesn't have a right of choice on whether they get a vaccine or not? Doesn't compute. But so I'm getting a little bit far afield, but I think they've stretched the OSHA beyond all credibility.
Follow up, Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, and that's where I'm kind of coming back to where it says, if any employer requires vaccination for COVID-19 or enforces a COVID-19 vaccination requirement imposed by the federal government, between line 10 and 12 on page 10, we're just saying, well, the intent of this bill wasn't to stop anything, except now you got to jump through some other hoops. And so what I'm saying here is that the state does have power. And I've used this time and time again, and people don't like it. But we see other states saying no to federal drug laws and imposing marijuana laws in their own states. And they don't, and the state and the feds don't come marching in and say, hey, we're going to come take over your state. But we're not looking at this for what it really is. And by the way, and when you look at court cases, the courts have been very liberal in the decision to say that a state can afford stronger protections than that of the US Constitution. And we do that here. Many of you, maybe you don't know this, but back in 2010, I mean, I can show you pictures where I was sitting at the table where we were meeting with the legislators that were pushing Article 1, Section 38. I was there on that ground, helped run an election, stuck that bill in someone's hand. And it was all because we knew Obamacare was coming from the top for a top-down medical direction or laws. And now we're seeing all of it now. Now all of a sudden somebody says we got to do something and everybody does it. I think that's where we're at here. And I think we're just, I mean, look, I'm not going to vote against the bill. So that's not the thing here. I'm going to keep a bill moving so we can make something happen. But I just think that we've got too much in here that says, well, okay, if you do this to us, federal government, we're going to come and take you to court. And we're going to try to, I mean, where is that going to go? Every time we go to the courts, we have the power here. We have the power to say, hey, this is how it's going to be. And I think we're missing the boat.
Comments, gentlemen? No. Go
Mr.
ahead, Senator
Chairman, Senator Bouchard, with respect to page 10, lines 10 through 13, I don't know that it's showing deference to the feds. What it says is, if any employer requires vaccination for COVID-19 or enforces a COVID-19 vaccination requirement imposed by the federal government or the other entity, the employer shall grant an exemption as provided in this subsection. In other words, medical or religious or right of conscience. So we're saying to the Fed, to these employers, the Fed makes you do it, you're still going to grant these exemptions. Now, how far we would get in the federal court with that, I don't know. But I don't know that it's showing deference to the feds. I think it's showing defiance to them by saying, you can pass what you want, feds, but you employers, you better grant these exemptions.
One final thought, Senator Bouchard, and then we're going to go ahead and move on to some more testimony.
Simplicity here, Mr. Chairman, is that if we just got rid of the language that says if any employer goes along with the feds, it's right there, and said exemption shall be granted by the employer, would be much, what, I mean, why are we giving in to this language up here that's saying, well, if somebody says what the federal government does, then they got to do it this way. That's all I'm saying. You're leaving it open for arguments for the court. Because, well, look, you never had any intention to be against the federal government here. That's all I'm saying.
Mr. Chairman, one more question.
1 second, let's.
So to be clear, the topic of this session was COVID-19. So we had to have something specific to COVID-19. So section A of 2711-113 is current statute. Current statute does not have medical exemptions for anything. It's a pretty straightforward ad. The additional language, if you don't like the federal government thing, just say, any, I mean, you can stick with, you can just keep A, but B makes it specific to COVID-19. Makes a very specific demand regarding COVID-19. Maybe you don't need B. Maybe you don't need B. But the intent was to make COVID-19 specific, that they have to grant these medical or religious grounds exemptions. Mr. Chairman, I just want to be clear about, maybe you don't need it if, I think we need it for everything, right? Medical and religious, I would argue.
So,
This is COVID-19.
Brief follow-up, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, so no, I wasn't saying that to strike everything. I'm saying that you could say that exemptions will be granted without the language between 10 and 13 that says it almost makes it okay if you do that. I mean, we're never saying, we're almost just giving in to saying that OSHA can do it. And if OSHA does it, then this is what we're going to do. I'm saying that if you have the language there, the courts will come back and say, well, you're saying right here, if they enforced a requirement imposed by the federal government, you're not saying they can't impose something with the federal government. So that's just my opinion on how the courts will treat it.
Okay, Senator McKeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kinski, Speaker. I heard something earlier, and I'm kind of new to this, so maybe you can clarify for me, or I have an oversimplistic view. If we upset federal OSHA, they'll come in and take state OSHA. So it takes me back to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution and state sovereignty. And my question is, are we really afraid of federal entities taking stuff away from us? Or is it a federal funding issue? We let them do it so we can get federal funds. I don't see why we wouldn't tell OSHA, sorry, you can't play here anymore. Here's the 10th Amendment. Please go away. And maybe that is oversimplified, but can you help me out with that one?
Yeah.
Help
Mr.
us
Chair-
out, Senator
Mr.
Kinski.
Chairman, my heart is with you. The courts aren't. That's the problem. I mean, I think I can't remember, we learned in law school, somewhere between 1930s and 1980 something, there had never been a challenge to a federal law on the basis of the 10th Amendment that was held up by the Supreme Court. Finally, I think it was either late 70s or early 80s, there was like National League of Cities Abuses Usury, I think, something like that, where they actually struck something down on the basis of the 10th Amendment saying you went too far. Then I think there was the firearms case where they basically ordered local sheriffs, this is how you're going to enforce our law. And that was struck down. And so I'm with you. We need a US Supreme Court that will breathe life back into the 10th Amendment. And so many of these things come down to, who controls the US House and the US Senate and the presidency, and who's going to control the next two Supreme Court appointments. And can we rely on them to breathe new life into the 10th Amendment? So the reason that the state took on OSHA primacy was to protect ourselves from the same reason we took on DEQ primacy. We didn't want somebody coming in from Dallas or Washington or San Francisco enforcing the environmental laws. Now the feds have sideboards on us, but still, there's still issues, but still they're Wyoming people enforcing Wyoming statutes subject to, federal minimum standards. But I think we get a better outcome, a better result than relying on it. I'm anti-big government, but I'll tell you, my first session, I sponsored at the behest of the Realtors Association, the creation of a Wyoming State Housing Discrimination Board. And I asked them, why would I do this? And they said, because right now those complaints all go to Denver and they take 3 years to resolve. They said, this won't cost you anything. We'll appoint local representatives that serve without pay. And we'd like to be able to get these things done in 3 weeks or 3 months, not 3 years. So it's done purely as a defensive measure, taking on the primacy of those things is to protect ourselves from worse enforcement by the feds. I am hopeful for the day when there will be more life in the 10th Amendment recognized by the courts than there is now.
Thank you, Senator. Follow up.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kinski, I think we're almost allowing the court system to legislate and make law now based on what we're just talking about. And I think it can end here. I think we can end it. But I think it's going to cost federal funding. And I'm not sure we're willing to do that. And thank you for your time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I may,
Go ahead, Senator.
I'm not letting any of those things happen. I'm just acknowledging the reality of our situation. You know, there are groups that are continuously pushing back against the feds. I don't want to get anybody the impression I like this situation. Like I said, my heart is with you. The courts aren't. So as to Fed OSHA, it's not a matter of federal funding or not getting federal funding. We can turn down federal funding. They will still come in and purport to apply OSHA to our businesses. Funding or not, they will come in and say, they can say, that's great, Wyoming. We'll come in and enforce it for you. And the reason that we do it is not for the funding. It's to protect ourselves as much as possible.
Thank you, Senator Kinski. And thank you for confirming that you have a heart, by the way, because I'd heard otherwise. If we could, committee, if it's okay with the committee, get some other testimony up here and give these two gentlemen a break. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I do thank the committee for its time, for its indulgence, and for the good questions. I've got another obligation in another part of the building. I'm trying to figure out what we're going to do for the rest of the week. So I'm going to go excuse myself with Senator Kinski's leave and go work on those tasks. But I do thank this committee for their work and their consideration of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Fickle, for your work at drafting the bill. We appreciate it. Looking to the room, I see we have a couple of legislators here. Representative Henderson. Anything to say? No. President Dockstader. Thank you. Is there anyone else in the room who would like to testify? This is the most boring room. Oh, she touched her mask. Nope, I guess not. Do we have anybody? Oh, Abby, you've changed. Do we have anybody online? Nobody online. Committee, do we have a motion? Bill is moved and seconded. Moved by Senator Furphy, seconded by Senator Hutchins. I can barely talk today. Let's look through some amendments. And I believe one of the amendments you brought to us, is that correct? If you'd like to come up to the table, Senator, just walk us through that one real quick. And
Mr. Chairman, based on so much that I've heard here in this very fruitful discussion, I want to pull the amendment and retool it and bring it back out tomorrow.
I think that's acceptable.
Thank you.
Senator Hutchins.
I have amendments.
Okay, talk to us and tell us page, lines, and what you want.
And with the help of the speaker and Senator Kinski, I think, I hope these will be A-OK. We have page 5. On line 8, after the word 19, oh, excuse me, on line 7, after the word, the number 19. Hold on, let me get there. It is line 8, after the word 19 for COVID-19. Can we remove the or, add a comma, and then on line 9, after 19, the semicolon there, or alternative COVID-19 preventative measures? That's one of them.
Okay, let's work that one first.
Yes, sir.
Make sure that our attorney got that one down. Did you get all that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Kinski, do you have any comment on that before we move forward? Nope. Committee members, any comments? Question on the amendments? Oh, Senator Bouchard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I understand what the attempt is here, but I'm concerned that as we keep digging in deeper, we're telling doctors and we're getting into that medical field. You know, and that's where it bothers me because and we don't have a bill on the other side to let doctors do what they need to do. So how do we start defining these things? I mean, without real definitions of where that goes. So that's where my question is.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Well, Senator Bouchard, I did have in the amendment alternative COVID-19 preventative measures, i.e., and I listed them out. If you would like them to be listed out, if that helps you out a little bit, you could go with the injected vaccination. There's also oral homeopathic medicines that are available. There are alternative medicines that are available. And the religious communities, say like the natives, may have remedies that they choose, comma, etc. So we can list them out or just put that there are alternatives to COVID-19. We don't need a doctor we're not jumping into the business of being a doctor. We're just saying that the employee has the right to choose an alternative to the vaccine. I can choose something, like I said, a homeopathic remedy or orally ingest something that has been approved to prevent the COVID-19 virus. So it's not just the vaccination that's out there.
And I would just like to interject here. Sometimes we get too specific in legislation.
Gotcha.
And when we become too specific, then next year or the year after, and something new's out there or 10 new things are out there, then we have to go back and revise and revise and revise. And I use the example of marijuana and synthetic marijuana. We've had to revise that at least 4 times since I've been in the Senate or in the legislature. I think we need to be cautious. I think we need to leave it a little bit open, but just my thoughts.
agree.
Go ahead, Senator Bouchard.
So let me try to clarify and maybe think about how this could be more friendly. So I think something that says if they're under the care of a doctor and that doctor deems it's a treatment for that. See, because I don't want someone going and saying, well, yeah, I'm doing this. I'm doing this and this and this. I want them to be able to say, look, I have a doctor that's treating it. And here's what they shouldn't have to open that up to everybody to see and say, well, I'm taking these things or I'm taking that. But if they were being treated by a doctor as that doctor deems fit, so that's kind of where I'm thinking. Just to hopefully, I'm trying to be more help you be productive with it. I'm not trying to drag you down.
Mr. Chairman, I understand what you're saying, but I do agree with the chairman that just saying alternative COVID preventative measures works best because I'm on homeopathy. I'm not under a doctor's care. Homeopathy has kept me COVID free. My husband had COVID. I didn't get COVID. So my homeopathy worked. I wasn't under a doctor's care. I've taken the homeopathic classes and friends work with their homeopathic protocols. So you may not be under a doctor's care, but you're taking something. Let's say we have a country doctor here. He's good with the oral homeopathic medicine. So he may prescribe it or give it to you, or you can purchase it from him, but you're not necessarily under his care. So by adding a physician's care with some of these alternatives, let's say religious alternatives, the natives, what if they have some concoction that they brought up? Do we have to list that you now are under the religious care in the native community? I don't know. Like you say, do we want to just keep listing everything out or just keep it simple? An alternative preventative measure and keep it that way. It includes so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator McEwen, go ahead, sir.
I'm trying to get from point A to point B on this discussion. And I see it as two separate issues. I see this bill aimed at vaccinations and prevention. And then I hear us talking about treatments. So kind of asking for clarification on everybody's thoughts on that.
Mr.
ahead.
Chair, I didn't mention treatments, medicines, and remedies.
Right. And I would agree with that, Senator, that it fits in this paragraph on page 5, that we're talking about vaccine is marketed to diminish or decrease the symptoms. We're under the guise of vaccines, and I think this is all under preventative. That's my interpretation. I didn't stay at Holiday Inn Express, and I'm not a lawyer,
Right.
but
If you look at line 8, Mr. Chair, you'll see it says marketed to prevent COVID. So there are alternative medicines out there that are marketed to prevent COVID, but they're alternative to the COVID-19 vaccine. Unless you are kind of in that community, you don't know, but there are alternative. I'm looking at Senator McEwen, Mr. Chair.
I know. what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Okay, very good. I think that's reasonable, and I think if there's any suggestions by either Senator Kinski or someone else on the floor that perhaps you can discuss that.
I will.
Bring it back to change the wording, but I think that wording, and we have that wording down. So question on the amendment committee, all in favor, raise hand, please. All opposed, same sign. 1, that amendment passes. You have another amendment. Senator
Yes,
Hutchins.
sir. On page, or I don't know if this will make it easier, Danielle, for you, but I'd like to add right of conscience anywhere where you have religious or medical contraindications to the bill. It was, I'd like to add that right of conscience.
Can you find those for us real quick?
Let me see. I know we had one on page 6, Danielle, line 19, 20. We also had it on page 10, at least in just briefly going over the bill. Let me see, what line was that? Line 15 and 16.
Can you do me a
And
favor, Senator
or-
Hutchins? Will you just read from line 14? Just read it where you put that in, just so I'm clear. on-
Line 14?
Yeah, on page 10.
Okay, exemption shall be granted by the employer upon submission of written evidence of an objection on medical. We'd have religious or right of conscience grounds. And it's also at the top of page 10, sir, on lines 1 and 2.
Right, so technically we have to change that from medical or religious. We have to change it to medical, comma, religious,
Correct.
comma, or. So we just have to grammatically, and LSO is much better at that than I am.
And that will be added to 27, as Speaker Barlow said, 2711, 113 Bravo.
Everybody got that? Any questions on that committee? No questions? Question on the amendment. All in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? None. That amendment passes as well.
Mr. Chair, I think I have one more, and this was something I think that Senator Bouchard brought up. I'm hoping I'm not overstepping. On page 6, line 15. No person, Speaker Barlow mentioned entering or public entity right after the word person. I don't know if that was Senator Bouchard or Senator McEwen's suggestion.
I was thinking that was actually in one more place in the bill as well.
There's one more place.
I think so. Senator Kinski, can you help me with that?
Give me a moment.
Closer to
The wrong bill.
front. Do you remember? Was it on page 5, line 20, sir? I think that was the other place, Speaker Barlow mentioned it.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, Senator Kinsley.
I believe it would be page 6, line 15, B, which is the beginning of the prohibition. No person shall require another person to receive COVID vaccination unless, and that should say, or public entity.
After no person.
Yeah, or public entity shall require another person.
So we just add or.
They
That's
have
what
to have
we're at.
added-
That's what was the amendment.
And then, so then on page line 18, little I, the person or entity requiring has adopted guidelines.
I think that was the only 2 spots.
I think that's it.
I think so. Now, what I would suggest is that if we go ahead and pass that between now and when this comes to the floor, that we look and get the definition of person maybe a little bit better, because it may not be needed. I don't know that it hurts it, but go ahead, Senator Bashard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think the language that either we leave it alone, look at the definition, because person would mean anybody that is private or public. But if you're going to include the entities, it would be no person, no entity, public or private. So that would be
Mm.
the way to say that.
Or how about no private or public entity?
Go ahead, Senator
Friendly
Kinsley.
amendment to the
Uh,
amendment.
Perhaps Danielle can carry back to the Senate Amendment Office conceptual.
We got the concept. If you can take that back and get it right for us, 'cause you guys are the brains.
And that would be a floor amendment.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you, Senator.
And
that's a good plan. Further amendments committee, I have one on page 4, where we're talking about taking effect before October 31st. And I only make this suggestion with any time the legislature does something that's retroactive, sometimes it gets us in trouble, that we move that date to be at least sufficient to cover after we get out of session, whatever day that might be. My suggestion would be November 10th, but that's subject to anybody else on the committee. But I think that when we do something retroactively, we can sometimes get into trouble and ends up in trouble down the road. So that's my suggestion, November 10th, and that would be the amendment I would suggest. Go ahead, Senator Bashard.
Mr. Chairman, could we not just use the language that says as soon as everything has been done, to meet the constitutional requirements, or how we use that general language that basically says immediately, and as soon as everything has been, all the hoops have been jumped through. We've used language like that on other bills.
So put that into words for me, Senator Bashard.
Um,
Oops doesn't work.
I don't remember the language. I think maybe LSO could help me, but usually it says something like, this will go into effect immediately as soon as all constitutional obligations have been met. There's something to that. We see that on other bills.
How about if we said something like that, that took effect after this bill was passed into law? That work?
Can you look at page 12? This act is effective immediately upon completion of all acts necessary for the bill to become law as provided by Article 4, Section 8 of the Wyoming Constitution. Is that what you're saying?
No, we're
Nope.
talking on page 4 where the employer,
Yeah,
we're
but-
talking about when the employer established a COVID-19 vaccine requirement.
Okay.
So this has to do with when this employer, when this person that owns that business actually puts the requirement into effect. And we just looking for a date of what that is. If we leave October 31st in there, then we run into perhaps a little bit of trouble with somebody
That's
saying, well, you
exactly.
passed a law about something that already happened. Go ahead, Senator Bashard.
Mr. Chairman, just upon enactment of this into law. something to that effect, just so that way it coincides with enactment. That's when it becomes established.
I think that's a friendly amendment. Committee, further comments? No comments. Did we get that? Abby's back.
Abby made.
You guys are like
she
magic
may
over
know.
there.
You got,
Yeah.
you look refreshed.
So all we did was there in that line 2 on page 4 was just that took effect before enactment of this law or this legislation. We're just taking the October 31st away.
He's wondering about the
He
correct
likes
wording,
it.
Abby, for doing that.
Yeah, for where it says the employer has established a COVID-19 vaccination requirement that took effect before the enactment of this legislation. 2021. Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, I threw in a date, but that probably makes more sense to throw in on effective.
20 days.
We're not going to be here 20 days. Bite your tongue. No. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Committee? Question on the amendments. All in favor of that amendment? Raise your hands. All opposed, same sign. That amendment passes. Further amendments, committee? None. Would we like the question on the bill committee? Question being called. Roll call.
Senator Bouchard. Senator Furphy. Senator Hutchings. Senator McCune.
Aye.
Chairman Baldwin. 5 aye votes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Senator Kinski.
Thank you.
May the force be with you. 8:30, is that correct? Did I hear right?
Yeah, I thought it was 10:30.
I wish. I think it was 8:30 to the floor. I don't know.
I believe this.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's 8:30 on the floor. Okay.
Thank you all very much.